Now, I called Pinocchio the darkest Disney feature, and I meant it. And before you come at me in the comments about Hunchback or The Black Cauldron, let me explain what I mean by darkness. For one thing, it is literally the darkest. Out of an 88-minute runtime, 76 minutes take place either at night or underwater, where terrible things can be waiting around any corner ready to ensnare you. For another, it contains the most terrible things, with almost every scene presenting new dangers and villains out to get our hero for no other reason than because they can. Now, there are certainly other Disney movies with more adult themes, but these films tend to confuse children more than scare them, or go over their heads and scare their parents instead. But Pinocchio is dark in a way that kids can fully understand, maybe even better than grown-ups, and that's what makes it so scary. It finds its target audience and speaks directly to them, like a serpent whispering the idea of sin into your ear. Take, for example, the most mortifying scene in Disney history, where Pinocchio and his friend Lampwick are playing pool and Lampwick gets turned into a donkey. It's shot as full-on body horror, with the tough young hoodlum instantly dropping his too-cool-for-school facade and crying out for his mother as the last of his humanity is sucked from his bones. He then violently thrashes about the room as Pinocchio begins to transform as well, while Jiminy, having seen the terrible fate that awaits the boys, rushes to save him before it's too late. The scene pulls no punches. We watch it all play out in full gory detail, so there's no room for children to leave the theater having not understood what happened. But there is one thing that parents might have missed, which they'll only stop to consider when their kids ask them about it on the ride back home. Why did Pinocchio leave? Remember, his goal is to prove himself brave, truthful, and unselfish, and yet when he discovers a child trafficking ring, and when his best friend is abducted and disfigured before his eyes, he runs away and never looks back. Nor does he then alert the authorities or even mention it to his father once they're reunited. He simply accepts that this is an evil too powerful for him to fight and moves on. And it's easy enough for adults to overlook this sort of detail. They'll say, oh, it's just a cartoon, they probably just didn't have time to tell that part of the story. But kids won't be able to put it behind them so easily. Lampwick is much more real to them than he is to us, and they'll still be thinking about his awful fate as they lie awake in bed for the next several weeks. So for them, the moral isn't that you should be good in order to make the world a better place, it's that you must be good in order to survive. Being unselfish in this context doesn't have anything to do with looking out for others. It means thinking about yourself in the long term, resisting shallow impulses that are certain to come back and bite you soon and hard. Snow White inspires us to live virtuously, but Pinocchio demands it. It makes our options clear in no uncertain terms. Be a good boy, or else. See, children don't fully grasp how to process things like sex, or drugs, or even hatred, but they absolutely know how to process fear, which is why so much of Pinocchio is told with the visual language of a horror film. It's full of nightmare imagery, with constant reminders that death and dismemberment are very real threats in this universe, long before we get to any of the actual scary scenes. Geppetto's cuckoo clocks feature animals narrowly escaping execution, and children being punished for misbehavior. Pinocchio, before he comes to life, is framed with an eerie stillness that's inspired countless killer doll movies since, with multiple shots playing up the uncanniness of his hollow puppet body. And the script is littered with ominous foreshadowing, with many of the lighthearted gags in the first act taking on a much more sinister tone once we know what's coming. But to really understand what makes Pinocchio's journey the darkest of any Disney character, we have to look at the forces that oppose him. Let's talk about the villains. While most Disney films feature just one antagonist, plus maybe a sidekick or a small entourage, in Pinocchio there are 5 different villains, each more menacing than the last. Honest John and Gideon are petty con artists looking to squeeze a buck out of whatever dope comes their way. They don't live in a faraway realm, but right outside your front door, ready to trick you with a new scheme each morning. Gideon is the lightest of the bunch, a slapstick character who deals in Harpo-Marxist prop humor. He was originally supposed to speak and had a full vocal track recorded by none other than Mel Blanc, but Disney decided late in the game to make him mute and cut all his dialogue except for a few hiccups. Honest John is a little more threatening. The self-proclaimed brains of the operation, he's not satisfied with picking pockets like Gideon and instead looks for long cons with bigger payouts. He also gets the very first Disney villain song, chanting "Hi diddly dee" to drown out any objections as he diverts boys from the straight and narrow path. Next up, you've got Stromboli, the hot-tempered puppet master, animated with maniacal rage by the great Bill Teitla. Like Honest John, he puts on a front of kindness, but the monster comes out the moment he's got you in his grip. Coming halfway through the film, it's his two-sided nature that flips the story from a world of merriment, in which villains are pathetic creatures easily outsmarted by all but the most dim-witted suckers, to a world of corruption, in which evil is ever-present and perhaps an even more powerful force than good. After that, we get the Coachman, who spirits away badly behaved children in the night. While the other villains are just in it for the money, the Coachman is the personification of pure evil, clearly less interested in the trivial gains of selling donkeys to salt mines than in the satisfaction of punishing boys for their wicked ways. With no name or backstory and shapeless shadowy figures doing his bidding, the Coachman might very well be Satan himself, and Pleasure Island the inferno to which all sinners are riding, a theory that's hinted at more than once in the dialogue.
I've got a coach load leaving at midnight. We'll meet at the crossroads, and no double crossing.
But waiting at depths deeper than even hell is the wrath of nature, here embodied by Monstro the Whale, an unstoppable behemoth who destroys whatever stragglers the other villains leave behind. Crashing through the waves with thunderous momentum and an unearthly demonic roar, it's clear that this is the apex of all apex predators. As described in one of the film's promotional songs, were all his crimes laid end to end, they would stretch from Maine to Barcelona. He's the whale that swallowed the whale that swallowed the whale that swallowed Jonah. And so, in Pinocchio, we see not just a multitude of bad dudes, but the full scale of villainy in all its forms. A reminder to children that evil wears many faces, and that there are people out there who simply want to hurt you and don't need a reason why. Now, it shouldn't make sense to have all these villains in the same film. You'd think it would cause tone problems to have a character who keeps an oversized mallet in his pocket in the same universe as the literal Prince of Darkness, let alone sitting at the same table. But there's one thing that ties all 5 of these evildoers together. One common thread that sets them apart from almost any other villain in the Disney canon, and it's the key to understanding just how terrifying Pinocchio really is. It's not hidden, it's right on the surface, and I'm willing to bet you knew it was there when you were a kid, even if you've forgotten about it since. But I'll give you a little reminder.
And he shall smite the wicked and plunge them into the fiery pit.
In a story that's entirely about facing consequences for your actions, not one of the villains is even remotely punished. At worst, they're a little inconvenienced by Pinocchio's escape, but most will never even notice he's gone, and will continue in their wretched ways without a hint of comeuppance on the horizon. By the end of the film, Valfellow and Gideon are still snatching up boys on their way to school. Stromboli is still chopping puppets into firewood. The Coachman is still cackling over crying donkeys as he sends them into a life of labor. and Monstro still waits at the bottom of the ocean, consuming anything and everything that comes his way. Keep in mind that this was at a time when the Hays Code more or less required that any criminal action on screen be punished by the end of the film, so this was not an accidental oversight, but a defiant message from Walt to his fans. The man who had brought joy and inspiration to millions looked out at the world in 1940, watched us preparing to fight the greatest evil we had ever known, and said in a cool, clear voice that sometimes good doesn't win. It might survive, but it doesn't always triumph. Sometimes, evil is just too strong. So think carefully, dear children, before you wish upon a star, because even in a Disney world, happily ever after is no guarantee, and the only way to become a real boy is to survive long enough to grow into one. Perhaps someday you'll slay a dragon, or marry a prince, or have an adventure that's all your own, but not every child is so lucky, and there will always be villains lurking in the shadows for the next starry-eyed dreamer to come their way. And not just any villains, but these ones. They've still never been punished. For 80 years, they've continued to thrive in the Disney universe, without the slightest incentive to change their behavior. And even as our heroes return home victorious, you can still hear them whispering from the darkness, calling out their siren song long after the film fades to black, delighted at the unsuspecting viewers who think they've just witnessed a happy ending. No, children, you're wrong. We're still out here. We're waiting for you. And unless you can prove yourselves brave, truthful, and unselfish, we're going to get you. Hi, diddle-dee-dee.
Where do you suppose all the kids went to, Lampwick?
No, they're around here somewheres.